uh, bring on, let me click go live, and we are live. All right. Hello, all the humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Charles Darwin Sunday Speaker event. Remember, if you like our content, please press the like button, subscribe to get more of our awesome content. Join our Patreon, or better yet, become a member of HSGP. Today's presentation is in honor of Charles Darwin. This aligns with our understanding, which is rooted in science, that we are all evolved creatures and not created by a divine being. Evolution shows us that we can become better, change, and improve over time. We as a human species are better off than we were 2,000 years ago, and we've continued to evolve and change, usually for the better, even over the past 500, 150 years. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards good. Today, we have Robert Boyd with A Different Kind of Animal, How Culture Transformed Our Species. Rob Boyd received his bachelor's degree in physics from the University of California at San Diego and a PhD in ecology at UC Davis. He has taught at Duke, Emory University, and UCLA. He has been a professor at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change since 2012. His research focuses on population dynamic models of culture and is summarized in 2 books co-authored with P.J. Richardson, Culture and the Evolutionary Process, and Not by Genes Alone. Rob has also co-authored an introductory textbook in biological anthropology, How Humans Evolved, with his wife, Joan Silk. He and Joan have 2 grown children and live in Phoenix. His hobbies include rock climbing and bicycling. Please give a big HSGP welcome to Rob Boyd. Welcome, Rob. You are muted, sir. There's the presentation. And we need to unmute you. You're still muted, sir. Let me ask to unmute you, see if that works. Rob, still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yep.
Like the commercial, right? Okay, I'll start again. So what I want to talk about is how we can understand 2 things. The first is that there's no doubt that humans are evolved creatures, that we're descended from a ape-like animal that wandered the savannas of East Africa and the forests maybe 5 million years ago. And that's about as sure a fact as we have. At the same time, humans are outliers in the natural world. We're extremely unusual creatures. Now, lots of my colleagues in biology don't like to talk about this, and they dispute that humans are all that different. But I think it's pretty easy to see that even if we take standard biological criteria, that humans are quite odd. So let's start with an easy one, and that's species range. How come that's not moving? Okay, this is one of these satellite maps, composite maps of where the lights are on at night in the world today. And you can see that humans occupy virtually every habitat in the world, every terrestrial habitat, except Antarctica and the really far north reaches of Asia and North America are lightly populated anyhow. If we went back 10,000 years ago and an extraterrestrial scientist made the same kind of map, they would find that, and that map would have shown where the hunter-gatherer campfires were, not where the electric lights were on, but it would have looked extremely similar. By 10,000 years ago, people had occupied virtually every terrestrial habitat The only exceptions really are remote islands in the Pacific, Iceland, places like that. So now if you compare this to most other mammals, humans have an immensely greater range. So this is the ranges of our closest relatives, the apes. These are typical mammalian ranges, part of a continent, one or two habitats, and that's about it. The creatures with the biggest ranges are big carnivores like wolves and lions, but even they have much smaller ranges than humans. So that means that humans, in a very short period of time, have been able to occupy a very wide range of habitats compared to other organisms. So this is one of the standard criteria, right? Range, a standard biological criteria. We can take a bunch more. If you took energy processing or biomass, or the standard things by which we say this species is an important component of the ecosystem, we'd see that humans are really exceptional in every regard: energy processing, biomass, and so on. And this was true before agriculture, by 10,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherers had occupied most of the world. So I think of this poor macaque looking over Kathmandu and thinking, oh my God, what happened? So what I want to talk about is, how are we able to do this? And I want to do this in a strictly Darwinian framework. That is to say, no magic. No, people are just organisms. We're evolved organisms. We have the characteristics we have because evolution, natural selection, and other evolutionary processes made them that way. And at the same time, it's as if there's been almost like a phase transition. And humans are able to do things and turn energy and mass into humans at a much greater rate than any other creature. So what's going on? So the standard answer, I think you can find this in any number of textbooks, is we're just clever. There's a certain self-congratulatory aspect to this. The audience here probably remembers Yogi the bear, who was fond of saying, I'm smarter than the average bear. The standard answer is humans are able to do all these things because we're able to do causal reasoning. We have bigger working memory. There's all kinds of versions of this argument. And I think, measuring intelligence and comparing intelligence in different species is a notoriously difficult problem. But I think there's probably no doubt that humans are, in some sense, smarter than other organisms. But what I want to try to convince you of is we're not nearly smart enough to explain our ecological success, the fact that we're able to exist in such a wide range of environments. And to do that, I want you to sort of concentrate your mind. I want you to consider a thought experiment. I started out in physics. Physicists they like thought experiments. I never lost that. And this is the thought experiment. This is a region in Central Australia called Cooper's Creek. And I want to imagine that I maroon you, perhaps the entire Humanist society, at Cooper's Creek, and I give you supplies and stuff to learn how to make a living there. And after some period of time, let's say 6 months, I take away your last can of beans and I say, you've got to make it on your own. You've got to be able to extract energy and the other things you need to stay alive in this place. And you can't have any contact with books or anybody who's made a living here before. You've got to do this on your own intelligence. And this is not a ridiculous question, because this is exactly how most organisms learn to deal with their environment. So most organisms learn nothing from each other, or very little, and yet they have a genetic endowment, they've got a learning process, and they figure out how to make a living in the environments they're born in. And this even includes quite complicated behaviors. This is a cactus. No, which is this? This is a I'm forgetting the name of the finch, but it's a finch, Darwin's finch, that lives on the Galapagos, and it uses tools to fish grubs out of underneath bark in trees. And social learning plays, we know from quite nice experiments by a German behaviorist named Sabine Tebeck, that social learning plays no role. Each finch learns how to make the tools and extract the grubs on its own. Of course, it has a genetic endowment. Now, there are a few organisms that have the ability to learn from each other, and they get some social information. And this is a classic example. Chimps in West Africa use stones to open hard-shelled nuts to get the nut meats inside. And there's quite good evidence that observing other chimps in your group doing this increases the rate at which chimps learn how to do this themselves. But in all these species, including chimps and many bird species that do similar things, capture monkeys, there's nothing that's transmitted that individuals can't and don't sometimes learn on their own. So the social information is helpful. It helps organisms learn things a bit more quickly, but it's not essential. So the question is, are you going to be able to make it on Cooper's Creek without any social information, just based on your own smarts? And I don't like your chances. And the reason I don't like your chances is this experiment, which I call the Lost European Explorer experiment, has been conducted many times in the last few centuries. Some European explorers get lost in some unfamiliar habitat, and things go wrong. They run out of food and they starve, or if they don't starve, it's because they're taken care of by some local group who've been living happily there for generations. Here's an example. This is the beginning of the Burke and Wills expedition in southern Australia. There's a long and interesting and complicated story behind this, but to make a long story short, a very well-funded expedition started out from Melbourne with the objective of reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria. And it was, we know it under the names of Burke, who was a dashing military man with limited bush experience, unfortunately, and William Wills, who was a surveyor and cartographer, and there was another large group of people who went with them with camels and tons of food and books and all kinds of stuff. And they started north, and in August, I think was they left, and by November, they reached the center of Australia there. The red line gives their route. And that's Cooper's Creek. That's where I promised to maroon you. Burke and Wills waited around. The rest of the expedition was straggling up from Melbourne. All kinds of things went wrong. Finally, Burke, Wills, and two other guys decided to make a dash for the Gulf of Carpentaria, and they told the people, wait for us for 3 months. And when we get back, take care of our depot here. And it took them 4 months to get to the Gulf of Carpentaria. When they returned, their expedition had abandoned the place, and they were exhausted. They had no more food, and they were in big trouble. They knew they couldn't make it back to Melbourne on their own. So there they are in Cooper's Creek, and they're trying to make a living. They were starving, but fortunately for them, they were visited by members of a local Aboriginal group, the Yondawanda. And the Yondawanda took pity on these guys who were in such terrible shape, gave them 5 kilos of fish and a bunch of other stuff, and then went on their way. A couple of weeks later, the Burke and Wills ran into the Yondawanda again, and this time they were invited to the Yondawanda camp, where they were fed on a kind of cakes made from a plant called Nardu. Nardu is a fern, so these were ground, not actually seeds. Ferns don't have seeds, but what they call sporocarps. But they were essentially seeds that were ground up to make flour. So that's an Nardu plant on the left, and that's some Nardu seeds, and that's a grinding stone. Burke and Wills searched madly for the Nardu. And after a couple of weeks, they found it. They started grinding, making flour in quantity. They thought they were saved. They thought they could live. Their stomachs were full. But in a few weeks, a little more than a month, they began to fail. And after that, 3 of the 4 died. And one of them was rescued by the Yondawanda and kept care of until a rescue expedition arrived the next fall. So why did Burke and Wills starve? Of course, they never would have learned how to make Nardu flour if they hadn't met the Yondawanda, but even when they did, they still starved. So why is that? And the answer is, what Burke and Wills didn't know was that the Yondawanda processed the Nardu because, well, they were able to eat the Nardu because Nardu has an enzyme in it that degrades vitamin B, B1 in your gut. And if you subsist in Nardu, you end up with vitamin deficiency disease. The Yondawanda processed the Nardu in a rather complicated way to detoxify it, and were able to use it as a staple flour. Burke and Wills didn't know this, and they died. Now, they knew they weren't getting enough nutrition out of the Nardu. Wills wrote in his diary that there was something wrong. He couldn't figure out what it was. They were full, but they weren't getting enough nutrition. So why couldn't they do something else? After all, the Yondawanda had given them 10 kilos of fish. Turns out that Cooper's Creek in those days was a very rich fish resource. Aborigines in that area who fished mainly did so with nets. And so why couldn't Burke and Wills make a net and fish? That was the second big staple in the Aboriginal diet. Well, the answer is making nets is a complicated business. The Aborigines made nets from this, made cordage from this plant you see on the left there. It's called verbena. It's a sort of long, complicated process by which you extract the fiber, you wet the stalks to make fiber, and then you spin the fiber on your thigh to make a yarn, and then you use the yarn to make proper line by making a 2 or 3 ply line, etc. Right? So this is complicated. Burke and Wills couldn't figure it out. Now, the Australian Aborigines are famous among archaeologists for the simplicity of their technology. Nonetheless, if you were to try to write down an instruction manual for Aboriginal technology for use in Central Australia, it would be a rather lengthy book, and it would cover things like baskets like this one, fish traps, boomerangs, fire drills, spear throwers, bark boats, groundstone tools, the list goes on and on. And that's just the things. There'd also be a volume on ecological knowledge and a volume on social relations and so on. My claim is that it's beyond, oh, I've got a few more pictures here to show you. Here's a fire drill, a spear thrower. My claim is that for an individual to learn all these things, all the things that are necessary to make a living in this part of Central Australia, is way too hard a problem for the smartest people in the world. It doesn't matter how smart you are, you're not going to figure out all these things over time. And we know why the Yonder were able to do it. A boy or a girl growing up in Yonder Wonderland in those days didn't have to figure out all these things themselves. They could acquire them by learning from their parents and grandparents and other people in their population. They were heir to a pool of adaptive knowledge that they could acquire from others. Burke and Wills didn't have that, and most other animals, virtually no other animal adapts in the same way. And so the question I wanted to get at is, how can we understand the evolution of this mode of adaptation? How can we understand that humans adapt to a wide range of environments, mainly as populations accumulating information over time, not as individuals figuring stuff out? Well, it's fine to say that, but if you want to answer that question, you have to have an answer to this question here, which is, okay, fine, I'm heir to this pool of cultural information, but why is it any good? Why does it contain valuable information about detoxifying Nardoo and making nets and making boomerangs and so on? Now, it's kind of amazing, but there's been extremely little study of this problem by anthropologists. Economists have done a little bit on the evolution of technology, but most of it's not applicable to the world of face-to-face society in which people are learning things from their parents and their neighbors without access to science and writing and so on, which is to say all of human history except the last few hundred or perhaps 1,000 years. But I think the standard understanding of why cultural information is adaptive, why it's useful to imitate from others, goes something like this. Innovation is hard. Learning is easy. So people occasionally innovate. They understand what they're doing. They make some improvement. And then that improvement is retained by the fact that people can learn from their parents and others. And so on this view, culture acts kind of like a library. This happens to be the library at Harvard University. So it stores a pool of information, but the reason that the information in the pool is any good is because the people who put it there understood why it was good, and people use it because they understand why it's useful. So in this view, human intelligence is still important. Now, human intelligence is applied, not just important, but is the essential thing that makes humans different from other animals. And it's just augmented by the fact that we can preserve innovations over time. Now, I don't think this story is completely wrong, but I do think it misses quite a bit of why humans are able to accumulate. And in particular, I want to ask the question, how often do people know what they're doing? How often, so to take the example at hand, did the Yonder Wanderer understand why they processed Nardoo? So the process was quite complicated. It involved several washings and dryings, several steps. Did they understand why it was as many steps as it was, why the steps were constructed the way they were, and so on? Now, unfortunately, we can't answer this question because the Yonder Wanderer disappeared as a social unit only a few decades after Burke and Wills. Guns, germs, and steel did their usual nasty business. And so we can't know. But we can study food processing in lots of other groups in which people still engage in subsistence, and they process foods, not because they read about something or some doctor told them something, but because of the cultural traditions they live within. And so I want to tell you a little bit about a study that was conducted by, well, there's been a long-term study in a village in Fiji on Yazawa Island. This is a picture of the village. This is one of the remoter islands of Fiji. It's still mainly a subsistence economy. People get about 80% of their calories from the garden or from the ocean. The rest of the calories are mainly sugar for tea and cooking oil for things they like to fry. And they eat yams and cassava and beans and bananas and a bunch of other stuff. So it's a fairly benign environment, but it's still a subsistence economy. And they have a detoxification problem, just like almost all foraging peoples, especially ones that concentrate on plant resources. Plants are full of poison, animals less so, but in Fiji, there is a toxin which they have to deal with. This is a sea turtle that is one of the delicacies, and turtles and other fish at the top of the food chain, sharks, barracuda, other big predators, contain a fat-soluble toxin called Ciguatera. Ciguatera is builds up in the food chain because once you eat it, you can't excrete it too easily. So as you go up the food chain, or you have really long-lived animals like turtles, Ciguatera becomes more and more concentrated. It's a neurotoxin. It has quite nasty consequences. The first one is that people get their sensory modalities mixed up, and things that are hot seem cold, and vice versa. And eventually it leads to, if you get enough Ciguatera toxin, it can actually kill you. It's especially problematic for pregnant women. So it damages fetuses. And we know this. Medical science has only known this for about 40 years. And yet, all through Fiji and other parts of the Pacific, people have beliefs that hold that pregnant and lactating women should avoid eating the kinds of animals in which Ciguatera is highly concentrated. So Joe Henrich, who this particular research project is his research project, he did a process where a project where he interviewed people about what they thought was edible for different kinds of people, and he found that some foods, barracuda, rock cod, moray, eel, shark, sea turtle, were taboo. And I can say taboo here because taboo is actually a Polynesian word. It comes from Captain Cook brought it back. The word in Fijian is tambu, and it is a moralized prescription or proscription against eating, well, against a lot of things, but in this case, against eating these fish while you're pregnant, unless when you're lactating, which fits with the biology. So exactly the creatures you shouldn't eat if you're a pregnant woman are the creatures which the Fijian culture says you shouldn't eat. And even if you're tempted to eat them, which let me tell you, so the typical diet in this village is boiled cassava and very lean whitefish, and fatty fish like sea turtle tastes unbelievably good. So people want to eat the fatty food, but it's tabooed. And if a pregnant woman were to reach in at the table and reach across and eat something that was tabooed, somebody would likely tell her she shouldn't do that. That's bad for you. Okay, so where do they learn these things? We interviewed a sample of people and asked them where they learned that they shouldn't eat large predatory fish when they're pregnant. And here's the results. You can see almost everybody learned it from somebody else. Only 5% of the people said they had some direct experience that led them to believe that you shouldn't eat these fish. Mainly they learn from their maternal relatives, but there's this category of wise women in the middle. These are women who are experts in plant knowledge, in things that affect women's health and so on, and they're very influential. Okay. But the question is, so you're a kid growing up in the Fijian village, and somebody tells you, you shouldn't eat that stuff when you're pregnant. We're an evolved creature. Why should our brains be designed in such a way that we believe that? It's not like the kids are getting a lot of feedback because nobody's eating this fish. The time between you might ingest a fish and the time some kid that your baby would show symptoms of cingulate poisoning might be 9 months or a year. So this is hard to learn. So why shouldn't they do it? And on the culture as a library view, they should avoid the fish because somebody gives them a good reason why they should avoid the fish. So when they're sitting at the that's boiled cassava. When they're sitting at the table, well, people eat on the floor, but when they're sitting at dinner and they would love to eat that delicious turtle steak, they eat the cassava instead. The beliefs would have to be something like, there's going to be an outcome which you don't like, it's going to hurt your child or hurt you, and that's enough to keep you to make the choice to eat something you'd really much rather not eat. You'd much rather eat the turtle, except the culture provides you with reasons not to. And this is what a lot of people think is the truth, but it doesn't fit the facts on the ground in Fiji. So we surveyed a large number of women, and we asked them what would happen to somebody who ate turtle or shark or barracuda while they were pregnant. What would happen to them? What would happen to their kids? And there was no consistent answer. Almost half the people said, I don't know. The remaining people did generally say something negative would happen to the baby that was eventually born, but they were completely inconsistent with both what we know about the symptoms from science and from each other. So it was weird stuff like they would have smelly joints or rough skin. And they all, the answers have the flavor of, I know I'm not supposed to do this, it's bad. This anthropologist has come and asked me why I don't do it, I don't know, so I make something up. This is certainly, we know people do this all over the world, nothing special about the Fijians. With very few exceptions, actually almost no exceptions, nobody really seemed to understand the connection between the actual symptoms that are associated with cingulate poisoning and eating fishes that are likely to have high concentrations of cingulate. So it's not the case that, at least in this case, and I would bet with Yonda-Wandera, most people are adopting this belief just because it's what the people in their culture tell them is the right thing to do. Okay, does this make any sense? Can we understand this as an evolutionary outcome? Well, here I'm going to kind of wave my arms. Some of the work I do is mathematical modeling, and I build standard kind of evolutionary models in which organisms have either, in the simplest model, two sources of information. They can either observe the behavior of others, that's cheap, or they can accumulate direct evidence, and they have to choose amongst a series of alternative behaviors. Some of them lead to higher fitness, some of them lead to lower fitness, but it's hard to figure out which ones lead to higher fitness in a noisy, variable environment. And then I ask, and people who do the kind of work I do ask, is it possible for natural selection to create a brain which is predisposed to most of the time cheaply observe the behavior of others, even though you're not sure why it's the right thing to do? You just do what other people do. Now, occasionally, the world provides you with good evidence, and then you adopt it. And that's where human intelligence certainly is important. The models show that when it's hard to learn stuff and environments don't change too quickly, and it's possible to see the success of people, even if you don't know what caused that success, selection favors individuals who are extremely prone to imitate the people around them and require really quite strong evidence to convince them otherwise. Quote, early humanists, they're bound to the dead wheel of custom. Now, in today's world, where we have books and writing and institutions devoted to creating information, the trade-off is different, right? We still, I think, behave this way. But in the world of the village, where nobody's keeping extensive records, in which experiments are expensive, you've got to eat every day and you've got to get that food out of the village, out of the sea or out of the garden. Learning is tough and expensive. And so if environments don't change too quickly, gradually populations will accumulate adaptive knowledge, and then you're better off imitating and figuring out stuff on your own. There is archaeological evidence that people in Greater Australia, this is back before Australia and New Guinea were separated, have been using Nardoo for 30,000 years. So Nardoo has been a useful food. The environment's not changing very fast. It's extremely hard to learn the sequence of events that you have to do to make it useful. So it's a good candidate for the kind of cultural adaptation that I claim is what makes humans such a success. Okay. Now, a lot of people are skeptical. They say, this is, there's a philosopher, an Australian philosopher, who's made fun of me for saying this stuff. Really, do you really believe that complex adaptations like Nardoo processing, making nets and all that stuff is an accumulation of such a dumb process with no intelligence in it? And I really do. And one of the reasons is that natural selection can create complex technologies with no intelligence whatsoever in other animals. So this is a weaver bird's nest. It's a beautiful construction, involves all kinds of knots. If you're interested, I can tell you quite a bit about it. Compare this piece of technology, this artifact, to the artifacts made by lots of hunter-gatherer societies. This is a Hadza house. Both are useful, both keep the sun and the rain out. Which one is more highly designed, I think, is a matter of opinion. And there are much more spectacular examples of gradual accumulation by complete chance of complex artifacts. So termite mounds are miracles of engineering with air systems to control CO2 concentration, humidity, and temperature. The termites that are building this, tiny little animals working completely in the dark, have no representation of the termite mound in their tiny little brains. They're just exercising an algorithm. You don't even need a nervous system to create complex artifacts. This is a house built by an amoeba. I can tell you more about that if you're interested, but I'm going to move on in the sake of time. The thing that makes human adaptation and the adaptation by genetic evolution, so human cultural adaptation and genetic adaptation different, is genetic adaptation is slow. And as a consequence, each species populations fragment into many species. Different species are adapted to different environments. Each species has its own solution to the problem. These are the nests that characterize many different species of weaver birds. What makes human adaptation different is that culture, even though it's gradual on the scale of human lifetimes, is slow, is extremely fast compared to genetic adaptation. So we make, which is to say human small-scale societies make, lots of different houses that are appropriate to lots of different environments. So there's the Hadza house. People in deserts make tents. People where it's very cold make snow houses or houses made of felt. That house there on the upper right is a kind of house that's built in Irian Jaya, Western New Guinea, in a place where people are rather worried about their neighbors. The house on the lower left is from Morocco, not Tatooine, and so on. So because cultural adaptation allows the accumulation of information, it can do things that individual brains can't do. But because it works much faster than genetic adaptation, it has allowed humans, a single species, to adapt to an extremely wide range of environments. Okay, is any of this true? Well, Charles Perrault, who's an archaeologist at ASU, conducted a really nice study in which he measured the rate of cultural change in artifacts. These are things like stone tools and ceramics, pots, and so on, and compared the rates of change to a famous study by a biologist at Michigan, Phil Gingrich, almost said Newt Gingrich. And the vertical axis is the rate of change. The horizontal axis is the rate of time, the length of time over which the change was measured. And because the changes are frequently much shorter than the length of time over which it was measured, there's a negative slope. So it's the up and down difference between the two lines that gives you the rate of the difference in the rate of cultural adaptation and the rate of genetic adaptation. The vertical axis is logarithmic, so that means that you have to believe me when I tell you that there's about a factor of 50 difference between the rate at which pots and stone tools adapt to new environments compared to the rate at which things like femurs and teeth evolve to new environments. So culture really does accumulate over time, and but it accumulates much more quickly. This is a study by Charles and another ASU colleague, Sarah Matthew. And what they did is they looked at a big data set of cultural subsistence economic practices that was collected around the turn of the 20th century by the Berkeley anthropologist A.L. Kroeber and his students. And what they had a measure of cultural history, which is to say what language that a group spoke. So I should say, Kroeber sent his students out and they collected the same data from hundreds of different Native American groups all over Western North America. Almost all of them were hunter-gatherers, some exceptions, but most were hunter-gatherers. And Matthew and Perrault then asked what predicts what people are doing in the environment they're in. Is it the environment, the rainfall, the kind of plants and animals that are available, temperature, stuff like that? Or is it the language they speak, which is a measure of their cultural history? This graph gives the ratio of the extent to which, in the statistics, language versus local environment predict what people are doing. And you can see both are important, but especially for things like subsistence and technology. But in every case, except subsistence, language is a better predictor of your behavior than your environment. And sometimes, like in the case of kinship or politics, it's a much better predictor. So what this means is that if you want to know why somebody's growing corn or making the kind of arrowheads they're making, it's at least as important to know what their cultural background is as it is to know what environment they're adapting to. They also showed that that this effect diminishes over time. So if you look at more distant cultural relatedness, which is to say, well, let's say just look at more distant cultural relatedness, environment gets to be a better and better predictor. And the time scale is about 1,000 years. So cultures are relaxing to the environment they're in on timescales over it's about 1,000 years, which is like lightning when you're thinking about genetic evolution, but is slow when you think about individual lives. Okay, now my claim is this changes everything. It explains why humans are so good at adapting. But it also explains, I think, something that some of you may be thinking about, which is, don't people do a lot of weird stuff that doesn't make any sense from an adaptive point of view? And the fact that we are cultural organisms, I think, explains both why we're so good at adapting to a wide range of environments, why we're so successful at turning energy into people, and why we do so many goofy things. So here's my favorite example. I misspent my youth climbing mountains. This is the Hillary Step on Mount Everest. It's quite close to the summit, about 500 feet below the summit. And if you count, I count 39 mountaineers trying to get through the traffic jam here on the Hillary Step. It's a totally miserable experience, right? They're cold, they're frightened, it's hard to breathe, and the death rate on Everest is about 5%. So on average, 2 of these guys are going to be dead before they get back to Kathmandu or wherever they started. Nonetheless, people can acquire the belief and get involved in a cultural system that makes this a really cool thing to do. And I say that as somebody who, did not this particular stupid thing, but just as stupid things in my own past, because I thought it was great. Okay, so We can get involved in prestige systems like this one that lead us to do goofy things, but this is a kind of, Alex Honnold, Glendale Cap, et cetera, but this has huge effects on human lives and human societies. What happened? Here it is. So this fella here, namely me, when I still had color in my hair, commands resources that would make Louis XIV green with envy. We all do. We all can fly to Europe. We can all, next week we'll get a COVID vaccine. We don't have to live in fear of smallpox or plague, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, this guy has only had 2 kids. Now, one of the first strongest predictions of evolutionary theory is selection should modify brains so that people strive to have the optimal number of kids. The more resources you have, the more kids you ought to have. That's true widely across the animal kingdom, but it's not true for people. As we've gotten immensely wealthy in the last couple 100 years, we've had fewer and fewer kids. Now, there's good reasons for this, and they have to do with the cultural success of people who have fewer kids and how they're imitated and admired by others and so on. But that's not my main point. My main point is that human life is replete with examples in which we get ideas, and I would guess from the Humanist Society, many of you might include religious ideas, which have no basis in fact, may or may not do us any good, but are not something you'd expect a self-respecting, evolved creature to do. Wouldn't expect baboons to go climbing Mount Everest, but humans do it. And they do it, I think, because cultural adaptation is a two-sided sword. It involves a trade-off, inherent trade-off. The benefit of cultural adaptation, the thing that caused natural selection to shift the human species from being a kind of typical ape to being the very odd creature we are, is that once you start imitating, high quality information accumulates in populations, and you can get that high quality information on the cheap. You don't have to figure out why everything you're doing is the right thing to do. You just do it, and you'll in fact be better off if you do that. Selection will favor a brain like that. But the cost is, it only works if you don't vet all the information that is available to you. You have to be credulous. So weird ideas like small families and climbing mountains and other ideas like that can spread. And even though they may be idea by idea highly maladaptive, and I think we can easily think of examples, the adaptation of being a cultural organism that my claim will always lead to such things is immensely beneficial. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. I'll end with a plug. If you're interested in more of this, reading more about this, I have a short, rather accessible book called A Different Kind of Animal. It's fairly close to the lecture I just gave you, but with a lot more details. And if you want to get the adult strength version, check out The Secret to Our Success by Joe Henrich. He is my former student who's surpassed me immensely. And this is a great recent book explaining the details of this idea that Joe and I and several other people have been pushing. So that's what I want to say. I think I will stop sharing now, Ron. Is that probably the right thing to do?
Yep.
Or I have a few more. I can share again if I need to show some of my, I do it all speakers do. I have slides in reserve, but anyway. Okay, guys, Thanks. Questions?
So as always, please raise your hand if you're interested in asking a
Wallace got her
question.
hand up.
Oh, all righty, go ahead.
Thank you very much, first of all. And secondly, maybe this doesn't even matter, but we seem as a species to really value intelligence or at least impressed by IQ. And one thing that stuck out to me that you said, it was your first viewing of the weaver bird nests. And you said no sense of intelligence at all. And if I think of,
I'm sorry if I said that. Go ahead, finish your question. I should let you finish your question. You've moved.
well, perhaps you'll answer my question before I even ask it, if you want to.
Go forward.
So if I think of intelligence as the ability to learn, and maybe that is displayed by change in behavior, even if it's merely genetic adaptation, it's still, to me, intelligence, especially if we seem to elevate a species' value in some way by thinking it's more intelligent, and I even don't eat them. So I'd like to give all species more credit. So I'd like to think that even if there's another word for it, there is an intelligence in everything, especially during this viral time. It's adaptation as being some kind of intelligence.
Yeah, so there's a continuum, right? The people who study animal artifacts like birds' nests and beaver dams and termite mounds and invertebrates make all kinds of artifacts. If I said there's no intelligence, I misspoke. Weaver birds are really, in terms of bird nest building, really the champs. So the people who keep track of this, they ask, how much does the animal understand, or in psychological jargon, have a representation of the process by which they make the artifact, in this case, the nest, and what the costs and benefits are of alternative decisions. So make the little tube at the bottom longer or shorter, etc. And there is a beautiful series of experiments done with weaver birds to measure how much they understood about what they were doing. And I would say the answer is they understand partially. So if you, so you can raise them in an aviary and you can go in and mess with their nests. They can fix some kinds of manipulations, but not others. Most birds just are executing an algorithm. They start and they do what they're going to do. And if you take something away, they don't go back and fix it. They just leave it that way. And that's really true of things like termites, and there's many examples like this. So, and I actually think humans do that mainly as well. Mainly, I think that, so I have a study that a fellow named Jake Harris and I have done of bow making amongst the Hadza, a group of hunter-gatherers. And the Hadza have some understanding of what they're doing, but they also don't understand what they're doing, at least as far as modern science goes. So if you ask them what the effect would be of changing the kind of bows they make, sometimes they can tell you the right answer and sometimes they can't. And so I don't know whether this fits with what you were saying or not, but I actually think the gap between humans and other animals in how much they understand what they're doing is much smaller than most humans think. We tend to think of ourselves as the smartest creatures on Earth, and we do have more complicated cognitive processes, at least in some domains. But I think the big difference is where we get our information. The weaver bird learns nothing by observing other weaver birds. Social learning plays no role in, they never see a nest when they build their first nest. Only males build a nest. So a male fledges, he's never seen a nest built. He sets up a territory and he starts building a nest. He learns.
Yeah.
So the first nest he builds is not as good as the second nest he builds, so on, although most of the learning occurs in the first few. Where good can be measured in functional ways, you know, how much water it keeps out, how strong it is, etc.
But as we describe or think of intelligence, would you deny any species some sort of intelligence?
I think it's a continuum, right? I mean, so I showed you the picture of the amoeba with the kind of stone house around it. So the amoeba doesn't have a nervous system. So by ordinary standards that psychologists usually use, it can't think, right? It doesn't have. Nonetheless, it does seem to have an algorithm by which it collects stones, and then when it divides, half of the amoeba gets to keep the old house, and the second daughter amoeba has this collection of stones inside its body, and then there is some process, which is not well understood, that causes those stones to migrate to their appropriate place on the outside of the body and form a new house. Well, that's surely a kind of intelligence, right? I mean, it manipulates the world in a way that's beneficial to the amoeba.
That answers my question.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Chet, you're up next, and then Roy. Chet, go ahead.
Well, I really liked your talk and the idea that people can adapt in misadaptive ways by going along with what's going along is, and I'm a engineer. I've studied system control theory.
Oh, did you? Okay.
And I don't believe that, based on my education, that you can control the future by force of man-made laws.
I'm sorry, a little louder.
That the future can be controlled. In other words, we can create a certain future for ourselves
Oh yeah, no.
by force of man-made laws. And I think that's a misadaptive thing that is threatening life on this earth.
Yeah. Well,
That's what
I
my
mean,
concern is.
rates of change are, 1,000 years is way too slow, given the rates at which technology is changing the atmosphere.
I mean, the idea that we can each secure a future for ourselves is a powerful idea. So it's understandable that once someone thought of it, everyone jumped on the bandwagon.
Yeah.
But I'm questioning. I really appreciate your talk, and I'm going to read some of your material because you really pointed out how everyone can go along with a misadaptive idea without having any sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's for sure true. And I think, I'm interested in the evolutionary questions, and I have my own political, social views, but I really do think that in the modern world, with the rates of change that are being imposed mainly by technological change, I think that the rates at which culture can adapt no longer fast enough.
Well, I tell you, I've got to leave. Thanks for your talk, and I got to go get my shot.
Yep.
See?
Well, thank you, Chad. I thought you'd appreciate this talk particularly. I'm glad you did.
Certainly did.
Roy, you're up next, and Jim.
Here we go. Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear you mention one of the basic things that has a large effect on our changing our world, and that's curiosity.
Yeah.
I remember being in my crib and looking out and going, I wonder what this is, that is. What happens if I touch that? Ow, oh, that's hot.
Yeah.
You know, this is something that I think I see in nature as well. You know, birds coming into my patio and looking at things and, is there anything I can use here or whatever? It seems to be, to me, the major impetus for invention and expanding our knowledge is just wondering, what the heck is this about? Would that be a reasonable?
I mean, it's clear that curiosity is a key component of learning new stuff, right? I mean, otherwise, how would you ever adapt?
Exactly.
The question is, how do you balance curiosity with what the social world is telling you? And I think the evidence is that people are extremely incurious, or if they're curious, their desire to fit in with what the rest of the people are doing is enough to suppress it. So educated people in 1500 had read Aristotle, and they believed that solid objects were denser than liquid objects. And so that meant that solid objects always sank. Now, you might ask yourself, well, they'd seen ice. Why didn't they think that ice floated? And Aristotle said, well, ice floats because it's flat. And, you know, I mean, they never did. People, I presume that people must have done experiments and thought, yeah, that's wrong. But until the scientific revolution of the early modern period, lots of really crazy ideas, you know, werewolves and all kinds of ideas that we would regard as superstitious and that were obviously false if you did a curiosity motivated experiment of some kind. And yet those things persisted. And I mean, my puzzle, I start from where you start, which is we're adaptive organisms. We should be trying to figure things out. Why don't we? And the answer I've come up with is because on average over the long haul, a little curiosity was okay, but too much was not so good.
Well, I think I recall a situation where don't ask so many questions, you know.
Yeah.
It was discouraged in many areas. I think one of the things that comes to mind is, and I've said this before, we're all victims of our upbringing. We come into this world, we didn't ask to be here, but we are all affected differently in our early formative years, and some people are just more curious than others.
Well, I think that's I think that's known actually.
And,
but
you know, so we're just going to have this large variety. But the ones that are successful, I think, are the ones that are going to survive the best, and the future will tell, though.
Yeah, but it's I think over the long haul of human evolution, people that were too curious and too willing to abandon what their culture told them must not have done as well. At least that's my story.
Yeah,
Okay.
they would have gotten that toxicity you were speaking of. Absolutely.
Hence we have different tribes. Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Jim, you're up next, sir. Jim, you're muted.
You're muted, Jim.
There you go.
Jim's got the beard for the occasion.
That's my Halloween to Valentine's.
Could you turn up your volume a little bit?
It gives me a solid Santa Claus through December.
Or a Darwin. He had, in his later years, he had quite a full white beard.
I want to divert the discussion back completely to the opposite of the previous question. Let's consider only what's really happening in the view of 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years. 1,000 years is 50 generations. Genetically, are humans responding to culture in a way that is good for the future of the species? And we're currently
responding genetically, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, our genetics has produced some of the features we see in our societies. But as a species, growing in number is always the best way to increase diversity. And we have done that so well. But as you pointed out, modern societies have dropped below ZPG. ZPG in China is not the issue it was. Sorry, let me go back to this one. So there is genetic shift going on in our species as a response to culture and growth.
Yeah.
Can we have any vision of where it's going, and is it going the way we want it to go?
Well, first, I think there's no doubt that human genetic evolution has responded to cultural adaptations. The most famous and best studied example is the ability to digest milk sugar, lactose, among Europeans and some North African populations. People didn't keep cows in Northern Europe until about 7,000 years ago, maybe 8,000 years ago. We know from the pottery residues that they consumed milk early on. From ancient DNA, we know they couldn't digest the sugar in milk at the beginning. In fact, the gene that, so there's an enzyme that is expressed in little babies, and in all mammals except humans, that enzyme is turned off at weaning, and the gene that there's a repressor that binds to the chromosome, and there's a binding site that gets screwed up, and that's the mutation that causes Europeans, Northern Europeans, to be able to digest milk sugar as adults. That probably spread in human populations in the last 3,000 years, from 0 to, it's a dominant, so the frequencies that it reaches frequencies of around 0.7 or 0.8 amongst English people, Norwegians, Northern Germans, people like that. So interestingly, it's that you can measure the strength of selection using genome data. I can explain that if you want, but it's not important.
I've read quite a few.
So this is the strongest selection we observe in the human genome, is the selection for lactose absorption. Yeah, for sure. Cultural changes are changing our genes. Most of them are not what the kinds you think of, though. So a bunch of them have to do with food, digesting starch. A bunch of them have to do with disease, because we've moved from
sickle cell,
plague.
And all Americans are descended from those who are immune to plague.
Right, plague. So plague is the A and B blood groups are partly an adaptation to plague. So anyway, the last study I've seen now is a little out of date, so you should take this with a grain of salt. This is about 5 years old, and this research is charging along at unbelievable rates. They compared adaptations in Beijing, Chicago, and Lagos.
Nice.
They found maybe 500 genes that had, out of 20,000, that had evolved. About a third of them were shared by all three groups, and so probably were on the order of 50,000 years old.
That's way old. I mean, the fact that they're all three shared says it's new. Yeah. Right.
And then, because Lagos, I mean, the last common ancestor of Africans and most Eurasians is more than 75,000 years old. But there's no evidence for, I shouldn't say that. So the trouble is that things that you're interested in, so psychological things, things that have to do with the roots of human behavior, are almost certainly affected by many genes, each with a small effect.
And we can argue how much genetics affects social behavior.
But even if it was 100%, so how tall we are.
That's genetic.
What biologists call stature.
How we're fed as children.
Well, it's about 80% are genes in European populations, about 50% worldwide. So there's a big genetic effect. And there's a way of measuring how many genes are involved in that, and it's thousands. So there are thousands of different genes that affect how tall we are. And you can't detect selection in those genes because each of the effects is too small.
So on any one gene, it's noticeable.
Yeah. So in a study, now there's a New York study, which I don't know. The study of a year ago, which we put in our textbook, the gene with the largest effect was 0.8 of a millimeter. The difference between one allele and the other.
How much effect on height it had? Yeah, there are any one gene out of 1,000.
Out of about 3,000, so
the good news is there's not an alpha male gene either.
No, I mean, but there may be lots of genes taken together that make. We just don't know. We can look at adaptations.
So this is still leads to the question, where are we going to be genetically in 1,000 years?
Well, that's your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
we are well over time. Thank you, Rob, for bringing this wonderful perspective to our community. I learned a ton.
Okay, Ron, thanks really for the invitation very much. I think it's great you guys are getting together. And
are there any podcasts, radio shows you'd like to promote, or where people can find out more information about you online, and any final words that you'd like to wrap up with?
If you want to find out more information for me online, robboyd.net will get you to my website. And all my papers, places where you can buy the books. There's even NPR interviewed me some years ago, and there's a short audio clip that has, the same basic story that I told today. So robboyd.net if you want more, or just Google Rob Boyd. Now you do have to, there's a downhill ski racer who's also named Rob Boyd, so you have to be able to tell the difference between him and me. But anyway.
Okay. All right. So as always, if you enjoyed our content, then smash the subscribe button, contribute to our Patreon, become a member of HSG, or volunteer to make the magic happen. Be well, stay safe, and take care. Goodbye, HSGP.
Thanks, Ron.